so with the onset of winter, it's always a good idea to check your customers' batteries to make sure that the change in temperature, if it's a marginal battery, is going to cause problems, and that's not what we want. So we have a couple of different ways to test a battery. Obviously, every manufacturer has some specific requirements, but we do have some general tests we're going to use. And this particular machine is a voltage amp tester, and I'm going to use this to test the battery, and I'm going to put a load on the battery, which is another way of checking the reserve that the battery has available. So I'm going to go ahead and hook this up, and this first check that I do is nothing more than hooking the cables up, and we call that an open circuit voltage test. And a fully charged battery should register somewhere around 12.6 volts or 2.1 volts per cell. You can see this battery at 12.2 is slightly undercharged, but in most cases that's what you're going to find. Now, in order to load test this battery, the requirement for the generic test is to find out what the cold cranking amps of the battery actually are. And I'm going to look on this label, and it's easy to read. This particular battery, the CCA, or cold cranking amps, are 600. So what I want to try to do is I want to try to load this battery for 30 seconds at half of the cold cranking amps, which would be about 300 amps. When I rotate this switch, I can vary how much of a load I am putting on the battery. And a good battery should hold at about 9.5 or 9.6 volts and not drop below that. So let's see what we get. But in order to read how much amperage I am loading the battery with, I need to take my high current amp clamp, and there's an arrow on there that's going to indicate the polarity, and in this case the current is going into the carbon pile in the machine. So I'll put the clamp facing the machine on the positive cable. I'll zero the scale, and I am going to turn the knob, trying to register somewhere close to 300 amps. And while I'm doing that, I'm watching the voltage, and my voltage is about 9.4, 9.3, 9.2. And normally what I like to do is the battery seems to be holding at just over 9 volts, which is marginal, but probably would get you through the winter. Usually I'll let the battery sit for a few minutes, and then I'll hit it again, and sometimes you'll see a significant drop, which would indicate that it's a failed battery. And in this case, I'm getting about the same reading. So that would indicate my battery is marginal, but probably acceptable, at least to get through this winter. Okay, so I'm going to use this same volt amp tester to check the output of the alternator. And it's going to require me to use the high current amp clamp, making note of the arrow and the polarity. And in this case, from the alternator down below, the current is traveling into the battery. So I'm going to clamp that around the positive cable. I'm going to zero my scale. This is a 12 volt system, but when the car is running, I can expect 13.5 to possibly as high as 14.5 volts, depending on the load on the system and the state of charge in the battery. So if we go ahead and start the vehicle, and you'll notice when we cycled the key that we had a negative current draw until the vehicle started. And in this case, the alternator, what the rated output under load or a low battery is about 70% of the alternator's capability, and you'll see it started out at about 100 amps, and the amperage is slowly dropping as the voltage steadies out. I can also use my load tester to put a load on the battery, raise the idle a little bit, and more, and you'll see that I am putting out over 100 amps, which is significant, and in this case about 140 amps. So without knowing the actual amperage of the alternator or looking it up on all data, I'm going to suspect that this could be at least 130 to 150 amp alternator. So everything looks good there. And I don't have a negative sign, which means my polarity is correct. And I don't have any ripple, which indicates the diodes in the alternator are good.